Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi mining community, welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And today's guest is Adam Wooldridge, who's the CEO of Cobre Ltd, who are a copper exploration and development company with a focus on the Kalahari Copper Belt in Botswana, one of the most prospective areas globally for new sedimentary copper discoveries. Adam is an experienced geophysicist and geologist with over 25 years experience in Africa, the Middle East and Europe, where he's worked in exploration management and consulting positions across a variety of different deposit types, specialising in large-scale, multi-disciplinary target generation. He's the founding partner and CEO of KML and has played an active role in developing Cobre's exploration projects over the last 5 years. And he's going to talk us through the company, the projects that they're working on, and some of the key takeaways when they were part of BHP's Xplor program, and obviously much more. Adam, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Great. Excellent, Rob. Thanks for having me.
No, appreciate your time as well. So, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career,
Sure.
how you got into the mining industry, and anything else you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, sure. My career actually started almost 30 years ago in South Africa. I started with Goldfields as a geophysicist. After that, went to BHP, worked for a few juniors, and then really went into quite a lot of airborne geophysics with Fugro. And then I was one of the founding partners of NRG after that. And then I think probably in the last 15 years or so, really sort of branched out into consulting. And something I've really enjoyed is the sort of really big scale, high level interpretation work. So got involved with quite a lot of that and lots of geological and geophysical interpretations. And then I think somewhere about 7 or 8 years ago, came up with the bright idea to start picking some of our own land packages. I think probably a bit naively in some ways. It was all about the geology to me at the time. You realize there's a lot more to the exploration than just the geology as you get into it. But we were involved in starting quite a few different startups, one in Europe. And then the one that's really of interest for us here is a project ground we pegged in Botswana in the Kalahari Copper Belt. So I've been involved with that project now for over 7 years. And we've really seen that grow from conceptual stage, pegging ground when there was still ground open, which is amazing to think of at the moment. It's a really tightly held package of ground in Botswana. And we've seen that sort of grow. Eventually that was vended into Cobre, and I carried on managing the program, and then took over as CEO of Cobre in the last almost 2 years ago now. And we've been running the project through Cobre from that point.
Yeah, and I suppose obviously you just mentioned that you've been the CEO of Cobre. Before you tell us a little bit about the company,
Sure.
Obviously you mentioned that you've been a geologist for most of your life. How's the transition from being a geologist with, I suppose, boots on the ground to now being
Yeah, that's an interesting question. They're quite different, aren't they? I must be honest, I still really enjoy getting into the field. I love the geological aspects of what we do. And I do try to stay quite technically involved in our projects as well. A lot of, I guess, from the CEO standpoint is almost creating the storyline and the strategy for the company, which is also enjoyable. So it's nice to marry that with the exploration work that you're doing at the same time. So it's just almost taking a step back and, bringing the two together to make it work.
And yeah, so I just wonder if you can just tell us about Cobre, about the company, the history of it, and how it's formed as it is today.
Yeah, so it originally started with exploration assets in Australia. They're still on the books. There's a couple of EMS deposits with a small resource around it. And then through differences, I guess a lot of mutual connections, a lot through Metal Tiger, which is now Strata, set up the original introductions. And they were a partner with us in the beginning, and they provided a lot of the seed capital for us to keep Kalahari Metals running. And then as a shareholder in Cobre, there was a kind of a common thread. And we vended our portion of Kalahari Metals into Cobre, and it was run as a joint venture for a year or so, and then Cobre took over the whole asset. I mean, the real focus of the company's exploration activities now is in Botswana. It's just got the kind of scale and size of discovery that I think really merit putting most of our money into there. So, yeah, our focus is really the Kalahari Copper Belt. I can go into the projects if you like. They're quite, it's really a big land package. So most of the ground's undercover. Well, it's all undercover. That's just the nature of Botswana. All sedimentary hosted copper deposits that we're looking for. We've got 5,500 square kilometers of ground, which is really substantial when you actually get on the ground and start driving across it. It's worth doing. You can spend several hours driving across each license area. And, we really focused our attention on basin margins and looking at things from a big sort of model-driven approach originally. And we've had quite a lot of exploration success now. We've got one area which we're looking at bringing into development stage. And then we've got lots of fairly advanced targets with, copper intersections on them. In fact, all our licenses now have copper intersected in our drilling. We've drilled almost 32,000 meters across the licenses, all covered with airborne geophysics, mag, gravity gradient, and EM, for example. And it's put us in quite an advanced stage now. And a really interesting one because we've got both development and exploration options.
Obviously, you mentioned most of the future discoveries are undercover. Obviously, this requires larger scale licenses, obviously bigger budgets, longer time frames for success. And obviously, which is often disconnected from market expectations for obviously being a junior explorer. How do you balance all of this and compared to other junior miners in the market?
Yeah, look, I think this is almost one of the problems with the market at the moment is it's very much focused on drill results and led by drill results. And it doesn't really allow much discrimination between companies, especially when you're at a greenfield stage. Early stage exploration, you've got large land packages, and how does it discriminate one junior from another? And, there's not really the metrics to work out which one's more prospective, if you like. So it's certainly in the early stages of exploration, I think it's really difficult to break through that. And that's probably a lot of the drivers behind BHP introducing their Xplor program was to try and sort of bridge those gaps. But for us, the way I've approached this, or the way we've approached this from a strategy point of view, is to do the big belt scale work. We've introduced basically a three-pronged strategy. We do the big belt scale work where we're looking for specifically the elephants, the tier one deposits. And as you mentioned, this is basin scale, often multi-year projects, and it can be expensive. We've done a lot of this generative work with BHP through the Xplor program in the last 6 months. But at the same time as we're doing the sort of the belt scale work, we were also doing strategic drilling. And, we've really had the benefit with one of our projects is next door to MMG's recent purchase of Kumukau in the belt. And that really lowers your threshold, if you like, to discovery. You're next door to a producer, you have the neurology benefit, and you'd almost play the classic junior game in a sense there, where you go along strike from the known deposits and look for new copper discoveries. And I think that allows us to introduce some shorter term windfalls to the market as well. And really give shorter term returns to our shareholders. And then we've got our development story, which is worth diving into as well. That's really our flagship project. We've put the better part of 17,000 meters of drilling into it now, and that has all the key ingredients for an in-situ copper recovery, which I'd like to chat through as well. So basically, we try and keep a three-pronged approach. Short-term windfalls with strategic drilling. At the same time, we have a development story, and then our elephant hunting.
Okay. I suppose if you want to carry on from that, how do you break down the belt scale exploration into obviously manageable targets, because it's such a obviously vast area?
Yeah, and I think this leads in again a lot of the work we've been doing with Xplor. It's certainly been a fantastic opportunity to take a step back and look at the basin macroscopically, if you like, and again from a belt scale rather than so I think we've added an extra step in, which is quite important. We're looking at processes firstly, not just trap sites. So if you're dealing with a belt scale, you can have hundreds, almost 1,000 kilometers of strike that you have to test, which is impossible. If I looked at the way we were exploring 3 or 4 years ago, really we're looking for the best trap site in each area and ranking areas based on trap sites, which isn't really ideal because you actually want to know if all the processes are working in each area. So we found gravity hugely useful, and we've basically taken the belt and broken it down into a series of subbasins. And then in each subbasin, you check the processes. So if you've got the right structural architecture, you've got copper endowment, you've got the right basin scale, size, etc., you then rank that highly, and then you look for targets within the little district that you've created. And this allows you to be way more effective with your target generation versus sort of blindly targeting across a basin scale.
I suppose what makes a deposit amenable to in-situ copper recovery?
Yeah, so that's that's very specific to one of our project areas. So if you imagine the typical deposit in the belt is, sorry to be a bit more geological, but I'll dive into a little bit of it. It's a vein-hosted deposit. It's typically bornite and chalcopyrite dominated. One of our project areas, and it seems to be the case on the northern side of the margin, we started drilling this about 3 years ago, and off the bat, we intersected chalcocite mineralization, only chalcocite mineralization. Now, chalcocite mineralization can be leached or floated. It's quite unusual. It's a really good characteristic about it. What you'd normally see in the Kalahari Copper Belt is you'll drill, and then it drops off from your high-grade zone to background within a few kilometers. What we didn't see here, there was no background. It carried on for probably 40 kilometers of strike. And we're looking at grades of, say 0.5% copper over 5 to 20 meters thick. But it's all steeply dipping. It's almost vertical or subvertical. So conventional mining just doesn't work. It's very difficult to get a conventional operation to work here. 70 meters of cover, so you can't open pit effectively. Going underground, you could, but then you can only pick the sort of high-grade pods out. And we kept looking at this and going, but there's something unusual going on here. You've got 40 kilometers of strike of mineralization. Surely there's a way we can try and capture the whole target. And just to give you an idea of scale, we've got over 100 million tons at 0.5% in here when you do the model work. So we started exploring a bit down the in-situ copper recovery route. And I think the other thing that's key is, this is what you need to sort of satisfy, is the mineralization leachable? Well, yes, we've got chalcocite, it's leachable. We've done some early met testing and proven it. It's also super fine-grained, and it's all hosted in fractures along this continuous structure. And then the next question is it below the water table? Now, immediately you have a contradiction in terms of geology. Your oxidized zone is usually above your water table. So we actually have chalcocite below the water table for most of the ore body, which means you can actually inject and recover into it. And then probably the million-dollar question is, do you have the right sort of fracture architecture running along there so you can control your fluid flow in the mineralization itself? And, we originally did a lot of desktop work. We did some AI work, which was quite fun, just sort of going through the core and picking out fracture zones automatically, and then going to the core and logging it and checking it. And what we really found was there's a main fracture zone right on the contact where all the mineralization occurs, and it's bounded by fairly impermeable layers on both sides. So the real test for us was to prove this in the field. And we've spent the better part of $1 million doing the hydrological work to kind of prove this up. We're just finishing that process off now. And the way you do that is you actually drill injection holes into the mineralization. So they're almost running down the mineralization, and then monitoring wells all around it. And you inject water in and see where it goes. So firstly, you had to prove it was permeable enough. We managed to check that off. And then you have to make sure it's not escaping laterally or vertically. And that basically checks off your hydrology. So those are the key. Then the last one is really putting in your leaching fluid. And I think this has become such an interesting field because of the environmental impact. You're injecting fluid is almost like a lemon juice concentration. It really isn't a very low pH at all. It's a weak acid that you're putting into the ground, and your ability to recover is simply neutralizing the fluid behind you. So there's no digging, there's no excavation. And if you can get your recovery rate to 40, 50 or 60% even, you've got probably something on the lowest CapEx OpEx curve for mining. And for me, one of the best parts is the fact that it doesn't have a big environmental footprint. That's really becoming a possible future way of mining, although it's obviously very specific deposits that actually are amenable for it.
What would you say, and obviously you probably mentioned a few, what would you say some of the key advantages are of In-Situ copper recovery, sure, as opposed to obviously traditional and conventional mining methods?
Yeah, look, I guess it really comes down to where you sit on the cost curve. Your capital scalable. You don't have to invest in your full operation from the get-go. You can develop your well field ahead of you. You can rehabilitate as you go, which is fantastic. You produce a cathode on site, which is really useful. So you can move yourself up the value chain as well. We were quite interested, but it looks like we can create a separate silver stream, looking at the metallurgy. So that we'd almost lose if we were floating traditionally with the grades that we're looking at. But I think the real key for us is if you have a higher grade zone and you use a traditional mining method, you're going to recover most of your ore body. Whereas here, you probably recover half. So it really does sort of lend itself to the lower grade deposits. And it can also be done as a hybrid model. Some underground work, some injection from underground work, and then some conventional leach work as you move along the contact. So we sort of envisage this sort of coming in the sort of a hybrid model.
And I suppose what are the stages to prove up In-Situ copper project? And I suppose, again, how does it differ from conventional development pathway?
Yeah, so I mean, what is different is, in a conventional development, you would go through jorking up your deposit, looking at your full deposit grade, tonnages, doing a trade-off study, identifying the best mining method, and then moving it through the JORC categories to feasibility and development. What we've done, and it's a little bit different, is your key drivers would be your hydrology. Can you get this to work? Is it permeable enough to actually inject into? Where does the fluid flow go? Can you control it? So you need to solve that quite early on. So there's no point sort of leaping in and jorking your entire deposit until you've sort of checked that box off. Then the metallurgy is a lot more complex because you're dealing with an in-situ environment. So you not only have to look at recoveries, you have to look at the acid consumption in your host rock. You have to look at your gang minerals as well and how they would possibly clog up the whole system. So there's a lot more metallurgical work that needs to happen as well. So the way we've done it is we've got a pretty advanced exploration target. Then we've sort of looked at checking of the hydrology, checking of the metallurgy. Then we're doing a scoping study, which we're nearly finished with, and that gives us a whole sort of financial justification to go ahead and JORC the deposit. So the JORCing comes a little bit later down the chain for us. That's actually the lower risk. And then you'd work towards a pilot study, which you'd put on top of that, and then that takes you to production. So it's just different stage gates and probably more along lines of what you'd expect if you're looking at a uranium deposit.
Yeah. Obviously, you've worked in various parts of of the world exploring. How would you say, how would you rate Botswana as a mining jurisdiction? And I suppose, what are some of the main differences or advantages that you found working in Botswana more recently for a period of time over maybe other jurisdictions around Africa?
Yeah, it's certainly the lack of corruption is refreshing. The accessibility of your Department of Mines, for example, you can actually speak to people quite easily and have meetings with them. There's a degree of flexibility, which you don't always get. It takes quite a long time, and you need quite a big land package to make discoveries here because you're undercover. So the cost of holding ground is reasonable. And there's definitely a flexibility and a partnership attitude that you get from the government that, well, it's not always the case sitting in South Africa.
Obviously, you've been part of the BHP's Xplor program. I just wondered if you can tell us a little bit about your experience of being part of that program and what you gained from being part of a 6-month program and what you learnt. And I suppose your interpretation of before you went into the program and when you came out of the program, because obviously you're an experienced geologist. I just wondered what kind of your interpretation of being in part of it and what you learned of being part of the program.
Yeah. So look, the Xplor program, I think for us, probably one of the best parts was almost taking you out of your normal work environment and putting you into a new environment and then giving you space and really taking a big picture view of the area that you're looking at and not looking on a target level, but looking on a belt scale. And obviously different deposit types would be a different metrics, but you really take a big picture view and then very much a process-driven view. So you look for all the key processes that would be required to form a large scale. We're not talking small-scale mineral deposits. We're talking the tier ones that would interest BHP, looking to see that those processes are there. And you actually explore looking for the processes, not just your targets. And this has given us space to actually, take a really scientific view of the basin that we're working in. And I think it's really given us comfort in some of our early strategy and kind of picking basin margins, for example, and a lot of comfort in the way we're targeting. A lot of the way you mentioned earlier, breaking down a belt into districts and smaller areas and using the processes to guide the targeting. All of that's really been born out of this program. But I think just in general, BHP have been very forthcoming with their own ideas. We've had a lot of influence now from them from the petroleum side, which is great, because if you're dealing with basins and fluid dynamics and trap sites of the sort of scale that they'd like, it's actually the petroleum geologists are streets ahead of us. So it's bringing a lot of that thinking into what we're doing in Botswana in a sedimentary copper environment has been really, really fun. Then, the rest of the cohort is an extremely talented group of people, and it's just been an absolute pleasure working with them and, swapping ideas and, certainly a fun 6 months. And the course isn't just about geology. There's quite a lot on strategy and, thinking a little bit longer term and business development and, it's been a really interesting 6 months. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, to be honest.
Yeah, I've had other guests who've been on the program, and they mentioned one of the things they've mentioned that they gained and learned a lot is around leadership. And obviously, for yourself being a geologist out in the field and now stepping into a CEO role, what have you learned from that program in terms of maybe leadership and strategy, which you may have not experienced being on the ground as a geologist?
A lot more than I normally admit, I'll be honest. So definitely there's a huge focus on developing teams, how teams interact. We've had quite a lot of fun working with this, doing business chemistry with our teams, for example. We had a lot of revelations come out of that were quite fun, particularly from my side. And then the strategy is also very good. I think one of the problems we have in the junior market is you tend to sort of keep your strategy to your next raise. It's fairly short term, just by virtue of where we are. To make a discovery, you need a multi-year plan. You need to have a long-term vision, and you need to be able to build that up and really build up and take risk to the positive as well as the negative. So make sure that if you have a discovery, you have the team, the backing, you've done all your government engagements properly, you don't expose yourself to risk, further down the line. So a lot of work on that, which I found actually really useful as well.
Yeah. And someone's obviously worked in the junior exploration space. I just wonder if you can just give us an overview of the current conditions, I suppose, across Africa. I get a lot of obviously junior miners on the podcast and saying how tough it is out there depending obviously where they are across the world. I just wonder if you can just give us an update of the junior space across obviously Africa.
So definitely, we're in a particularly tough environment at the moment. It's become really commodity specific, which can also make it quite difficult. I mean, if you look at a typical cycle to make a discovery, it's going to take you years, even from drilling success to actual production. And yet, you're forced with the market cyclical variations. For example, you'll stop exploring for lithium now, but you're actually exploring for 5 years' time, and the same happens with nickel. So I think we've been particularly fortunate in staying in the copper space. We're really looking at copper-silver deposits, and we're looking at sedimentary copper-silver deposits, which tend to be a fair bit higher grade than porphyries, for example. So we're just in the right corner of the market at the moment, thank goodness. It's definitely not an easy market. I guess looking at the rest of Africa, it also depends where you are. So, there's been a lot going on in West Africa, obviously, and companies have struggled more from that side. I think Botswana still has a definite glow around it, and that certainly helps.
Yeah. Lastly, what's the short to medium term outlook for Cobra? So looking out 6 or 12 months.
Sure. So I guess we just carry on following our strategy. On the In-Situ copper work, we've got a scoping and financial study coming out in the next month. It should be out at the end of September. And then this will really put us in a good position to actually start advancing that into a development stage. We'll drill that out and start working towards putting a pilot plant together. And then at the same time, we've got, we recently finished a seismic program, which is actually worth mentioning. So this is pioneering in the belt. Juniors don't do seismics. It's just, it's territory of majors and oil and gas companies. So this is also something that came out of the BHP program. We use most of the budget from the program on the seismic survey. And you start thinking and seeing resolution that you've never had before. And again, this is sort of centered around where do you find the big large-scale trap sites? How do you image them, and how do you plan your drilling into them? And what we're seeing in the seismics is you can see the trap sites, you can see the feeder structures. What you're drilling is so much more advanced than this circular feature looks interesting, for example. So we've got a lot more work along that line, looking for potential tier ones and drilling off the seismic data that we've already collected. And then we had recently put out an announcement on our Okavango project next to MMG. And we had some really encouraging first round of drill results there. So that definitely warrants some follow up. And again, that's it's next door to Zone 5, the recent $2 billion acquisition. So I think any success there is very easy to generate. Very similar picture to what we're looking at next door.
Great. Adam, appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing your story, your journey, telling us about obviously Cobra, what your plans are, and obviously part of being part of BHP's Xplor program and the benefits that you got from being part of that cohort. If our audience wants to reach out to you, if they've got any questions, if they want to follow your story, what social media platforms are you on? How can they follow you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. That's about as far as I got with social media. The company's on Twitter as well, or X, and then our website and email is probably the easiest to access.
No worries. We'll include that in the show notes anyway for our audience to access easily. Wish you well for the remainder of the year. We've still got another three or 4 months. So all the best for the remainder of the year. Perhaps you want to come back on the podcast sometime next year and give our audience an update.
Sure. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed that episode. As always, please keep sharing these episodes far and wide. Don't just share them just within our mining community or the mining community globally, but please share these episodes outside of mining. As always, we want to improve the branding and image of mining, and we can only do that through education. So thank you for listening, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.